Hey there, it's Zara Sethna, host of the Collapse Life podcast. We launched Collapse Life in September 2023 with the thought that our Substack and this podcast would be a thinking person's guide to civilization and demise. Or to put it another way, we set out to create a lifestyle channel for a dying lifestyle. Throughout human history, civilizations have come and gone. They've thrived and died. At no point, however, did humans disappear. Just because a civilization collapses, it doesn't mean we don't go on as a species. We may need to change how we live, but life will go on. The question is, are we ready? If you're watching this, you're probably a lot like us here at Collapse Life. You know change is inevitable, you know everything is not as it seems, and you can see we're at an inflection point. So it's worth facing the challenge head on. It's also worth considering the insights and advice of those with diverse knowledge who can help minimize the trauma of this coming transition for you and for your loved ones. And that's what Collapse Life is really all about. Our North Star is bringing you innovative voices, wisdom, and reason, so you'll not only survive, but thrive in the years ahead. Today, we're serving up a classic clip show, sharing nuggets of wisdom we've heard from our guests since this podcast started. The goal is to meet the new year with shoulders back and heads held high, ready for whatever is to come. Links to the full episodes are going to be included in the video description below, and we really hope you'll check them all out. In the meantime, enjoy the show.
There's a generation of children in the United States that will not have the same core nutritional delivery that I had basically by eating the earth in which we did before Big Ag. And so let's look at that. Yes, we know it's a problem. We know it's an issue. But if we go into war against multinational corporations, then that's what that is. That's a war. I want to collaborate with all the independent producers out there, all the families that are looking to feed their children. That's the most important thing for everybody to hear right now. If we continue down the path of divisiveness, that's what we're going to get. But what we're going to do is we formed a coalition, a mission that's going to decentralize our food in a way that it once was and that we had control over. We're going to start feeding our communities again. We'll say state of Texas. Texas is a big state. We have 254 counties. At one time, we had 254 microprocessing centers that served each county in the state of Texas. Okay, what does that mean? That means the microprocessing center is really the center of the universe. The processing centers themselves are the center of the universe. It's a pivot point. You have the product that comes in, a pure product that comes in a processing center, be it for animal protein or be it for produce. It gets processed and then it gets distributed out of that processing center. Okay, right now, as you brought up earlier, four processing, multinational processing centers or corporations control 85% of our animal protein. Okay, with the Beef Initiative model, which I knew from the very beginning, is that we have to bring the processing centers back to our communities. The war on beef is coming. This is something that we can segue into right now because the people need to have perspective of what do I mean by that. We have a global industrial food shift that is occurring. We had one that happened in the 70s. We're having one right now. Those contracts, the marching orders, that happened back in 2017. Okay, what the general public does not understand, this is unfolding. You're not going to stop it. There is going to be a centralization of our food supply in a way that people do not understand. But that doesn't mean that you have to be captured or trapped by it. This is the best opportunity that I've ever had in my lifetime to create a decentralized, community-based food system that is truth in food, that does give you access that you've never had here in the United States, especially after the last 10 to 15 years. Food has changed, folks, and it's about to change big time. And this is what I'm trying to get people to understand. We think there's an abundance of pure nutrition in this nation. We're not. In the United States, we are a food desert right now. So what you'll see is a new system that people first, they change their mindset. Why have we lost small town of America? What is the movement behind getting everybody into the cities? Folks, this is a prohibition going on against personal space and having free market access to your life in a way that we've known. It's coming. There's a monetary reset going on right now across this globe. I mean, that's a different podcast all within itself. And so, how do we approach this? Well, through your consumer demand. You know, I think there are tons of parallel systems that basically sprout from starting with truth in food. What is truth in food? Let's get back to what that is. People can have their own gardens. They can basically go out there and raise their own chickens. They can have a relationship with the rancher, and you can do barter systems. There's so much that people do not even realize that are right in front of them. I'm living the best life possible right now because I follow a protocol of making sure that I consume and my demand has nothing to do with multinational corporations. I don't need anything from them. I've proven it. I am proof of work. And it's not the same for everybody. It's not a one size fits all. But what there is there's traction in there for you to go out there and engineer a new consumption model that basically saves your life in a way that you don't see coming.
The first interesting thing at a time when America is in a deep economical problem, our debt has become beyond mind boggling and getting to the point where we may have trouble servicing just the interest. There's not a positive verse in that book about debt. There's a tremendous amount of different warnings about it. And so something that managed to be around for a couple of thousand years and be read by billions of people were pretty accurate about what debt problems can be caused. The other thing that's as challenging for people is there's a scripture that talks about God loves a cheerful giver, and I found that both when my giving, and not just because I was making money, but even in the tough times, and my tithing, when that increased, just seemed things worked out better. It wasn't always a monetary issue, but there was also a sense of good feeling and happiness where people have unfortunately tied making more money is the only way to get happier. That's not necessarily the case. And I must add that some of the happiest people I met were not the superstar athletes I dealt with that made tens of millions of dollars a year, but people just working for a simple income. And they had more true happiness than I ever saw in the people of real wealth. The problem we're facing is we have first an investment community that sells more money equals more happiness. Watch any advertisement. That's basically at the end what they're saying. If you come to us, we'll help you make more so you can have those things they show you at the end of the commercial, how everybody's happy. But it's also been tied into Madison Avenue and marketing by companies and all that simply more stuff equals more happiness. And what I like to talk about is I talk about my parents and grandparents, they never had the large dwellings that people live in now or I have lived in the past. They certainly didn't need something now that every mile or two you'll find on a main road, and that's called public storage, where a lot of it is used by people to keep extra stuff that they don't keep in their dwelling. So all this extra stuff and extra things, yet all medical psychiatric studies say we're more of a mess now than our parents or grandparents ever were. So more stuff doesn't equal more happiness, even though society would want you to think that the guy that owns the bus company will always be happier than the guy driving the bus. But in the real world, that's not true. It's unheard of, Sarah, for me to think that here 40 years that I am speaking about multi-trillion-dollar deficits, not debt, just a yearly deficit. A business could not survive the way the government has. We now have $33 trillion in debt, and we're literally seeing as much as $10 billion a day now being added to the debt level. It's unsustainable. We have a thing called the Congressional Budget Office. It's probably the only thing that's still semi bipartisan. It has come out with a study earlier this year that says at the rate we're growing, in less than 10 years, we're going to be at $50 trillion. And now they've cut it down to 8 years because of how much more we added on debt this year. If we get to 50 trillion and if interest rates are just 5%, which is not unheard of for those of us that have gray hair. People that are very young think interest rates are always at 0 or 1%. They're not. But just a 5% interest rate on that 50 trillion would mean $2.5 trillion in interest expense. The best year we ever had as a government was last year. We took in a little over 5 trillion. So half of all that income would go just to pay interest. It's unsustainable. We couldn't run the country in any way, shape, or form. 65% of Americans are working paycheck to paycheck. They will be unable to reach those nice commercials you see from the financial service firms and live that happily after life. But with it comes a lot of extra burdens. I myself am in the senior community. I'm watching people when I moved in 15 years ago who were okay then are having a much more difficult time living. Some have passed already. It's gotten so tough that now polls show that seniors 65 and over are more concerned about running out of money than passing away. We're going to have somewhat of a war, and I don't mean physically, but we're going to have a war of the ages where we're going to see younger people say that, hey, I'm being so burdened with taxes to help people in 80, 85 that are Medicare is paying hundreds of thousands to have these new lungs and all this stuff. And I can't even buy food on my table. And then that older person is going to say, well, I worked all these years. You said if you took out all this money out of my money, I would be able to do this. And, that is coming. We've seen it in other countries already. Canada, which is nearby and not probably one of the closest countries similar to us, is having a very significant problem that including encouraging older people who are really in a bad way, either health-wise or financial, to consider taking their own life, which is just, it's absurd for me, but it is happening. Up to 10 or 15% of Americans need help. We have to have social programs to help people who have had a tough time. They shouldn't be forever because then people get used to that. But the problem is that the governments were punishing the people who were still pulling. They weren't thanking them for being pullers. As more and more people are getting in that wagon and less people are pulling, those of us that remain pulling, they're demeaning us. They're like, you should be, pull more, give it. And the government can't even keep its own house in order. So I do think that less is more, which is my motto, is the appropriate model. And our parents and grandparents, many of them, my parents never had a credit card. They had a small apartment and everything, but I think they managed two good kids. I know two kids that are talking again to each other, which is a good thing. But I just think that happiness can be found in the simplest things. And the more simple we make our life and take away the burdens of worry about finance and stuff, I think happiness comes with that.
But what's happening now is basically two things. One is that the US has just gone crazy when it comes to borrowing money. Um, to understand the genesis of that problem, you have to go back to 1971 when we broke the final link between the world's major currencies and gold. Having a link to gold used to control how much currency a country could create and how much debt they could take on. When we took that away, we basically handed a unlimited credit card to the world's major governments. With the US in particular, because we had the world's reserve currency, everybody wanted dollars, so we could create as many new dollars as we wanted, borrow as much money as we wanted, and then send those dollars out into the global economy for which people would give us real stuff. So we've been doing that ever since. And because of that, there's a growing oversupply of dollars in the world, which makes the value of the dollar go down. That's one thing that's happening at an accelerating rate. In 2022, we had official inflation of 8.7% and unofficial, probably much closer to the truth, inflation of like 12% or so. In other words, the dollar lost a big chunk of its purchasing power. So that's going on, and it's not ending because we're continuing to take on massive amounts of debt. That's going to lead to overcreation of currency, which will lead to devaluation of the dollar. Now, at the same time that that's happening, we've been abusing the privileges that come with having the world's reserve currency. And we started to use the dollar as a weapon. If anybody steps out of line from the dictates of the U.S. global military empire, we kick them off the SWIFT international banking settlement system, or we impose sanctions so that nobody's allowed to buy whatever they have to sell, and we basically abuse other countries who get in our way, and that's leading a lot of other countries to look for ways around using the dollar so they don't have to be as exposed to what they see as US predation. The countries that are taking steps, actual steps to get away from the dollar include China, Russia, India, Saudi Arabia, quite a few others. But these are big players out there. And what they're doing is cutting, first of all, they're cutting trade deals with each other in their own currencies. So, for instance, Russia will sell oil to India and get rupees in return. Although that's not working out really well for them, but that's the original deal. And China is using the yuan to buy things around the world. So they don't have to use dollars as often as they do or have in the past. And that trend is called de-dollarization. And it's also accelerating. You know, these governments that used to keep dollars as reserve assets, in other words, they would hold US Treasury bonds as the basis of their national monetary systems. Well, they're starting to sell their T bonds and buy each other's currencies and buy gold. So this trend away from the dollar is accelerating on both of these levels, where on the one hand, the dollar is losing purchasing power. On the other countries are trying to use fewer dollars, and that's lowering the demand for dollars out there. So you put those two things together, and it means potentially dramatic problems for the dollar going forward. You know, because we're devaluing it at the same time other countries want to use it less and less. And at some point, that becomes a crisis. Right now, it's a kind of a slow burn, but that could change dramatically in the not too distant future. So the preppers, the people who once had this aura of kind of right wing crazies, are turning out to be the people who had the best lifestyle for being ready for what's coming. So we adopt a lot of those strategies, and we're halfway there, and that means becoming as food self-sufficient as possible, becoming generally as self-sufficient as possible. In other words, as handy as you can be, and in terms of energy, have a fallback if the utility isn't going to work as well as it did in the past. Maybe be armed. It's funny. A lot of people are appalled by the idea of, well, what's coming might be something that you should probably have a gun for, but that's potentially true. We're seeing civil unrest already, and let that spread, and you will probably wish you were armed. So that's another thing you can take a look at. And it's interesting. Gun sales are through the roof in the United States, and women are bigger buyers of guns than men are right now. So a lot of people across the spectrum in the U.S. are kind of getting the idea that if we don't have a civil war, we might have a civil war, but if we don't have a civil war, we could still have civil unrest. And those videos on TV could be coming to your town. And so you want to prepare for that kind of thing. One way to view what's happening in the world today is that we have kind of an aristocracy that's been allowed to take power. And that is a relative handful of incredibly rich people who exist up above the president, senator, Supreme Court justice level. And their goal is to siphon as much money as possible out of the 99% and into their own accounts before everything falls apart. I think that a lot of the stuff that's going on now, that are the big debates in society, are really engineered debates, like black versus white, gay versus straight, the whole immigration thing. These are ways that the aristocracy is using to distract the peasants from the theft that's taking part at the top of the pyramid. And so if we start paying attention to the world in that sense and see the argument as really about class, right? It's extremely rich versus everybody else, rather than all these other divisions that are kind of artificial. I think we'll see more clearly what's going on and have a better sense of what we can do to stop it.
The smart people in the room decided to keep changing the name. So it used to be germ warfare, right? During World War I and World War II. Then it became biological warfare. But then Nixon banned biological warfare work in 1969 unilaterally, and then the Biological Weapons Convention, this international treaty, came into force in 1975. So you couldn't do biological warfare work, so it had to be biological defense. And you could only justify it if you could show that it was being done for a peaceful purpose. For example, developing a vaccine. And so developing a vaccine kind of became the justification for doing this sort of work. But then biological defense, that term sort of lost its benign nature, and so suddenly it became gain of function research. Now, what is gain of function? It's the same thing. You're either making the microorganism more transmissible or more dangerous, more pathogenic. It's causing more severe illness. And sometimes what makes it cause more severe illness is also causing it to be more transmissible. So um, that's basically what gain of function is. And there have been lots of debates, both ethical and practical, about whether such research should be done. And where are the limits? What does the treaty permit and what does it not permit? So there's been, books about this and many articles. Unfortunately, the State Department and the people in the Department of Health and Human Services who discuss these things and sort of make judgments about them have been moving the goalpost. There have been many leaks from labs doing this kind of work in many countries over the years. And luckily, we think that, I think it was, what year was it? Don't remember the year, but in the 1970s, there was a flu virus that became the main flu of that year. And apparently it came from a 1950s flu virus. It hadn't mutated since then. So everybody knew it had been frozen. And then somebody was working in a lab and it got out and it became the flu of that year, 1970 something. And um, there have been six, at least, identified escapes of the SARS-1 virus from Singapore, Taiwan, and Beijing. Beijing having had 4 separate escapes. So, and there were 2 smallpox escapes from the same British lab in the 1950s or 60s that caused deaths. So, and there have been workers at Fort Detrick who have died from an escape or have gone into the local hospital not realizing they had caught something at work, some very exotic, bacterial or viral infection. So anyway, we have these reports, and the published reports have indicated for a number of years that there are about 200 potential escapes a year from US labs that get reported. That's 4 a week. So, so something, is bound to happen. And so that's what I assumed that, SARS-2 was going to be. And I think that the government, I don't know whether that's the federal government or the state government or where it came from, where the message came down from, but my state medical board went after me and said I was spreading misinformation on the internet and I was treating people with off-label drugs, and these were criminal actions, and they needed to immediately suspend my license because I was such a danger to the patients of Maine. And of course, that's ridiculous because I'd practiced 40 years and I'd never really had a complaint from a patient. I'd never had an adverse board action. I'd never had a malpractice case. No one had ever accused me of malpractice. I mean, I testified before Congress. I'd published papers. I'd given talks around the world. For me to have something like this happen was just silly. And I knew that it was perfectly legal to treat people with off-label drugs, and that 20% of all drugs are prescribed in the US are off-label. It's just a term that means it wasn't originally licensed for that purpose. And I also knew that spreading misinformation on the internet was another name for having an opinion and stating it. And we have a First Amendment that protects my right to do that. So I felt very confident that the board was acting way beyond its legal authority as well as its medical authority. But they used me as a poster child. They splashed my name all over, the media, and subjected me to a hearing. They wanted me to surrender my license, but I hadn't done anything wrong, and I wasn't going to surrender my license. And I wasn't sure how I would fight them, but I do work with Children's Health Defense, and so Bobby Kennedy offered to have them defend me, pay for my defense. And so I was able to mount a strong defense, showed that all the charges were spurious. And then the board came up with new charges, silly charges like not getting a written informed consent to talk to a patient's spouse on the telephone about them when they handed the phone to the spouse, that sort of thing. And the board found me guilty of all these charges, these little nothing. They left. They knew they were in deep water, hot water with the First Amendment. They didn't want to fight the First Amendment, so they dropped. It wasn't misinformation was no longer a charge, and they knew that prescribing drugs off label was not a charge either. That was perfectly legal, so they got rid of those. And they tried to, I don't remember if they got me or not, giving patients experimental treatments without an informed consent. You know, it's not really experimental if it's licensed. When you're going to stick something in a body, and you've bypassed, the nose and the mouth, which are the things that have mechanisms to prevent really bad things from getting in, you've got to know what you're doing. And that is not necessarily the case, particularly when you take away liability from the manufacturers. And so, unfortunately, all EUA vaccines have no manufacturer liability. And in the United States, all vaccines on the childhood schedule or recommended for pregnant women have no manufacturer liability. So that was a mistake. That decision was made in 1986 by Congress as a way to help the manufacturers of a few vaccines not charge too much for those vaccines so that everyone could have them who needed them. But it became a gold rush for manufacturers because here's an industry in which your buyer is a captive. The kids have to take these vaccines to go to school, or you have to take the vaccine to go to work. As a doctor, there are vaccines we had to take or we couldn't work. So, hepatitis B, measles, mumps, rubella, DPT are all required for medical professionals. Um, Flu shots have become required too in many places. So, um, when that happens, you've got a captive audience, you've got captive buyers, and you've got no liability. That's the industry you want to be in. You know exactly how many you're going to sell. The CDC is ordering, most of the supply, telling you how much to make, and all you have to do is make it and walk away smiling, as Albert Bourla, has done.
My read on it is it's a venture capital prospectus to transfer wealth from wealthy nations to the relatively poor nations to build out what the United States Defense Department would call the global health security agenda. It's not health, it's global health security. When I hear that phrase, I think bioweapons. I think laboratories. I hear the agenda to just seek, one health approach to looking for pathogens everywhere you possibly can find a pathogen with pandemic potential. What happened in 2021 was when the injections rolled out, they were supposed to go worldwide to frontline workers, doctors, nurses, that kind of thing, and maybe elderly or anyone else who was deemed to be the most highest risk. And that's not what happened. What happened was the United States and Canada and Europe and the UK and Australia, New Zealand, they bought up all that they can buy up. And there wasn't really enough to go along. There was a delay in getting the jabs. And at the end of 2021, all the nations called for a second assembly meeting, World Health Assembly, and the net takeaway from that was a declaration that they need a legally binding agreement to ensure equity. They didn't say anything about making sure people around the world are healthy, right? They want to make sure that the rich nations don't hoard all of the products that might be life saving and don't make all the money from it. What they should be negotiating, if they truly wanted to stop the next pandemic, would be a termination, a shutdown, make illegal gain of function research. Stop going into bat caves, pulling out whatever it is you think you can find so you can bring it into a lab and change it on the computer to make something that is more deadly that you then inject into people. That's a biological weapon. This is what they are actually pushing towards under the guise of, oh, well, we got to go look for the next pathogen. Well, I don't know too many people who are, off in a bat cave digging through guano and getting a respiratory problem. There are people who do that, and they need to be careful. Right? You probably should wear a mask when you're doing that. But to go into all of these areas, to go into septic systems to see if you can find a new version of polio and bring it into the lab and work on it, it's insane. But they're presenting it as, oh, the next pandemic is going to come from animals. Well, yeah, if you go and take it from an animal, bring it into a lab and make it more transmissible and more deadly, you're right. Stop doing that. If you've ever walked into a room and there's a bunch of cockroaches, as soon as you turn the light on, boom, they're gone. Right. And so that's what we're dealing with here. We're dealing with people who want to do things primarily in secret, because if you saw what they were doing, you would oppose it. Now, the media is complicit, and most of the alternative media has just ignored this thing completely for 16 months. And if they've reported on it, they've gotten it wrong. And so the confusion and the lack of information, what I try to do, it's kind of funny. They shorten it, they give it a nickname. I try to publish the missing information, and they want to call that misinformation. Well, I got news for you. It's their own darn documents. And so if it's misinformation, it's coming from you. But the point is, it's missing from the public discourse.
Actually, if you look since the 1990s, there's been a huge shift of the practice of medicine from solo practitioners or a small group into a larger hospital-based practice or larger multi-specialty groups. I think when that happened, that family environment where the family doctor who would make house calls, who knew all your family members, knew about your children, your parents, knew all those things, kind of went away, where you no longer had that one-on-one relationship with that same practitioner, but you actually were now treated with multiple different practitioners. So each visit you could see someone different and not have the same person. And I think those other people don't really know you as well. And so the care, I think, has kind of suffered from that. Medication works by blocking a process, whereas nutritional supplementation works by enhancing a process. Which would you rather have? And I think if you ask anyone, right, clearly nutritional supplementation would be the answer. So it was really my first experience with that, and really understanding how we can use nutrition as a benefit. I was thinking to myself, I'd worked 5 years in the hospital. I really need to give everyone back their money for those 5 years. Thank God it was all managed care and it wasn't a lot. But I really learned that I really wasn't practicing what I call foundational medicine. I really wasn't looking at root cause. And it was really my first look at understanding what root cause meant, and that how developing that root cause of foundation really, lent itself to a lifetime of health, rather than just fixing that individual problem, really creating a strong, foundation for long-time health and, survival. The doctors are not going to change for you. So I think the key is we need to talk to the patients. I think where sea change typically happens in medicine, it's really not at the provider level. It's really at the patient or consumer level. They're the ones who really change. So I think it's really educating them so they're better prepared. Look at all the research now that is in literature about good vitamin C levels, good vitamin D, really being preventative, like simple things. And that's still not part of a normal armamentarium to prevent this disease. And I think the key is to keep on pushing at that kind of patient consumer level. And that's really what I learned from Dr. Atkins. He was very good at talking directly to people and helping them understand so they can go back and change their practitioners or physicians or providers. I think that's how sea change is going to happen this round as well, not at the provider level, but at the patient or consumer level. I'll never forget my first, going back when I was doing my training in medical school at St. Vincent's in HIV. And the doctor who was my mentor was Michael Liguori. I'll never forget him. And he said something to me. He said, when someone trusts you with their life, that's the greatest gift they can give you. And you have to value that. That is, they can't give you any more than that. And I've always kept that in the back of my mind. Number two, he taught me, always remember something about your patient that's personal. That is, when you greet them and meet them, that really is important in understanding their repertoire and getting to, have a relationship. Like, to me, if my patient calls me by my first name, that's fine. I mean, if that's more comfortable for them, hey, that's fine. Listen, clearly they know I'm the doctor. It says it on my wall. They made an appointment to see the doctor. But the point is, you don't have to prove that you know more than them. What you have to prove is you're willing to work with them and together form a better solution and a better outcome.
So nobody's really truly probably a 2D thinker, but it's a matter of the world teaches us in 2D. So our education system gives us information and it's like a linear sort of dot, like memorize this and then that and then this and then that. And it's a sequential, like linear sort of learning style. Those of us who have multidimensional thinking, we struggle with that because we see things as much more deep, much more complex. So we're moving through the world, noticing how the sound is, how the feelings are, how you visually see it. And we put those all in our head and make it into like a more 3D visual or understanding. We make it more complex understanding. And we struggle to actually make it 2D because ours are so complex that we don't know what part you're talking about. So it's like taking a model that's highly dimensional and then saying like, let's make it flat. And that's what you're going to memorize. And the person's like, but which angle are you looking at it from? And we're unclear because we see so many more. Homeschooling is a funny thing because it's like you can school anyone anywhere. It doesn't need to be at home. But the idea that you're bringing home and giving your child a curriculum is another story. Our schools gave specific curriculums because they were trying to get you to a specific role in the world. Now, if that role is going away, then, well, that curriculum's not applicable. But I do use curriculums. I take the curriculums that people have. I know my one kid really likes math and science, and we go through all the curriculums there. But then I let her read and write as much as she wants, like, to accommodate that. We do bring all the curriculums in. My youngest is in Montessori school right now, and they put them all together. Waldorf incorporates them. The idea that we have them separately is actually so that we can go out into the workforce and do them separately, but then we don't. So I've always been confused why they do that separately, because that's also another part of the 2D versus 3D. By making it 2D in just one subject, you're limiting the child's overexcitabilities to engage. You're having make them repressing them. You're making it exceptionally boring, and you're making them just regurgitate, which means you're kind of leading them around and saying like, now do this, 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 and this. So it's not about thinking. It's not about growing. It's just about regurgitating. You should really recognize that there is a huge chunk of teachers and administrators that are trying to separate you from your child. Your child and you should never be separated. And our systems really do separate that so that they can use your child as a tool, because when you are broken, you are much more compliant. And you shouldn't let them break your children. You shouldn't let them, because the world is going to be so hard. The only thing that they're going to have is love and self-understanding and compassion. And if they don't have those things, I don't know that they're going to be able to find a community that will take them. I really do worry for the kids who didn't learn compassion and connection, because I wouldn't take a narcissist in a small community. We're going to be driving those people out in the future, not exalting them like we do now. So I think now's the time to teach your children how to be a part of a community, how to be good people.
It's already just about as bad as it can be. So lack of right to repair is our current situation. Our improved situation is making sure that farmers can fix their stuff without without having to jump through hoops, without having to go to the dealer and beg them to do something. And sometimes it's not just inconvenient, sometimes it's really impossible. There simply may not, there's situations where the dealer doesn't have the parts, or they won't sell you the parts because you've pissed them off. So, yeah, we need, for food security, absolutely, we need to have better control over what we can do when it comes to agriculture. And that's got to include right to repair. From a strictly practical e-waste standpoint, there's a really direct connection between throwing things away when they're still good and keeping them in use while they're still good. And if you throw stuff away because you didn't feel like getting it repaired, you are a major contributor to our really truly growing e-waste problem. But if you were to hold on to this thing and get it fixed, or maybe give it to somebody that could continue to use it, there's a one-to-one correlation between the e-waste that's generated by throwing it away and the lack of waste by keeping it. It's direct. It's mathematically easy to figure out. You keep a phone for 4 years instead of 2, you've cut your e-waste burden by half. And you've doubled the useful life of a gadget that was otherwise going to go nowhere. So that's, they will go to a landfill. There's very, very little actual recovery of useful parts out of discarded electronics. One of our charitable refurbisher friends that does try to recover everything that they're donated is less than 15% of what they're given. And that seems to be so there's 85% more stuff out there that's not getting fixed and reused, even when people are donating it for the purpose of continued use. This may be an old stat, but I think the EPA identified there was something like 3.5 billion pieces of electronics being discarded every year. Yeah, big. And it's not the stuff that it doesn't degrade in a landfill. It stays there forever and ever. The plastics will fall apart before the metal does. And all of the adhesives and all of the solder and all of the manufacturing chemicals that go into these things, they leach out and they leach into the water supply. So it's ugly here, but it's actually even uglier on the manufacturing side, which we don't see. And it's really tragic to see what's happening in non-US, non-European US Western nations, where people are they're exposed to all sorts of terrible stuff. The mining and everything else that goes into producing these products is really very toxic. And we're not taking care of those people because we only see the bright, shiny, pretty stuff.
So I bought a house in the north of Sweden in a small village in the middle of the forest and thought I had found my Eden, my utopia. Everything was fine. It was very natural, quaint, countryside people. But after about 6 or 7 months, I became aware of a wind farm. And my documentary really documents the early days of finding a wind farm, thinking this is a bit strange, it's not a terribly windy place, and then going into the depths. And it turned out that I was probably the last person they expected to move in next door. And rather than a NIMBY, I became what I call a NIAMBY, not in anyone's backyard. And it turned out that I had uncovered a General Electric massive fraud. They were launching a giant turbine that didn't work. But as part of this green fraud, there was endless money. And so I started to dig, and it led me through the Swedish courts, through the Swedish political system, NGOs, the United Nations, how corporates work, law firms, banks, the collusion, and in a way, a conspiracy. These people are conspiring together to do illegal, immoral, and destructive things. All your basic needs are met by nature. food, shelter, water, comfort, love, etc. And they're trying to synthetically replace that with machines. And machines always come with a price tag, a patent, an on-off button, and they're trying to shepherd us towards that. And although I don't reject technology, I mean, we're using technology now. It's kind of the E.F. Schumacher approach of appropriate technology rather than technology for technology's sake. We're worried about climate change, but where does a wind turbine get its energy? It gets its energy from the wind. So it's causing direct climate change because it's removing energy from the climate system. So it destabilizes, changes rainfall, but it's supposed to make the climate more stable. We have clean technology solutions in drawers of corporate entities across the world that have been sandbagged. We need to go back. We need to reinvigorate those. And I guarantee you that there is more than enough electricity to run our lights, to run our refrigeration, to run our computers. But it will also enable us to eradicate and just cancel and quit the unsustainable use of energy, the wastage. If you look at an electric car, I hate to tell anyone who has an electric car, you are driving death. It represents everything that is wrong with consumption. It's not efficient. It's devastating. It's wasteful. I'm not saying we need to go back to riding horses or everyone needs to get on a bicycle and walking, because I do think that. But we have plenty of technologies that enable us to be efficient and appropriate, and we need to do more of that.
We are doing politics differently because we are looking for more long term, and we know that we may not be elected right now because what we are telling today, it may be not that popular today, but we believe that it will become popular the more we speak about it. And the best example is the immigration file here in Canada. When I spoke about lowering our immigration level, having a value test for each immigrant, people were saying, "Oh, that's a racist party," and blah blah blah. But they won't be able to do that at the next election because now we have about 50% of the population in Canada who is fed up with mass immigration. So when I started that, maybe it was only 20%. So, our support is growing, and the next election will be a very nice challenge for us. There are kids who are transitioning. So our position on that is all these surgeries must be illegal, criminal to do that for the kids under 18 years old. If you don't have 18 years old, you cannot drive a car, you cannot go to a bar, but you'll be able to decide yourself without the consent of your parents to have a surgery that it will be the end for your life. They're going to start with hormones blockers, and after that, but all that must be illegal, and that's a responsibility of the federal government, because in Canada, the federal government is in charge of the criminal code, and our proposal is to put that in the criminal code. It must be illegal and criminal to do that. But Poilievre won't do anything about it, like Trudeau. The federal government with Trudeau or Poilievre, the conservative, are interfering in provincial jurisdictions. If you read our constitution, provinces have a lot of autonomy, but that's not happening right now. So a province like Alberta, they're tired about that. They want to have their own sovereignty in their own jurisdictions. But because of the regulations and legislations coming from the federal government, they're not able to do that. So you have a separatist sentiment in Alberta. And same thing in my own province in Quebec. You have that separatist sentiment. Actually, the leader of the Parti Québécois, the separatist party, is very popular these days in Quebec, and he's speaking about a referendum again if he's elected as Premier of Quebec. And the election in Quebec will be in 2026. So, because the federal government does not respect our constitution, you have movements like that at the provincial level for more autonomy.
We hope those were some useful takeaways for you. We really enjoyed watching back all those interviews while we were putting the clips together. Whether you've just subscribed or you've been with us since day one, we want to take a moment to thank you for joining us on this journey. And with the holidays now upon us, let's all reflect on what we can do better in 2024 to tilt the world towards the light and fight against those with dark hearts and a darker agenda. We'd also like to take a moment to extend a huge thanks to all our guests who took time out of their busy schedules to join us here on this podcast to share their stories and their expertise. From our family to yours, thank you and warm wishes. And a reminder to always keep your chin up. It's only Collapse. See you soon.